Right about there. Oh, hey there, and welcome to LFF Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Matt Marrash. If this is the first time you're stopping by the channel, there's a playlist of the 5th season that we're currently working on. If you haven't subscribed yet, every other Friday, we're gonna be here and we're gonna be chatting about something large format. Now, the reason I missed you last Friday is I wanted to be here on the day it launched, and that is brand new FPP Mummy 400. FPP, or Film Photography Project, started its black and white monster films back in 2019 with the introduction of Dracula, which was a 64-speed black and white film in 35mm size. It was wildly successful, and the following year in 2020, they released Wolfman, which was a 100-speed film available in 35 and 120. Frankenstein snowballed on top of that by adding a 200-speed option in up to 4x5. And this year, FPP has continued that tradition by growing even further. New Mummy 400 is available in 8mm, 16mm, 35, 120, 620, 4x5, and it's also the first of their monster films to be offered in 8x10-inch size. Now, of course, as someone that shoots 8x10 a lot, I am so excited to be a part of this, and I'm really thankful to Mike Rosso, Mr. FPP himself, for sending me over a couple of boxes to test out and give my opinion to you folks at home. Now, for transparency reasons, I have been a member of the FPP, showing up on the podcast, helping out with donations, and testing photographic materials for them for over the last decade. I don't make a dime from FPP, sometimes I get some cool films for free, but that's the extent of it. One of the founding principles of FPP is to engage, inform, and inspire creative individuals. And I also think that FPP over the years has also started to, through the introduction of its films, enable more people to shoot these things. Film photography is not getting any younger, and the materials are not getting any less expensive. Some of the cameras may have dropped off in cost, but film costs have gone up and up and up. And if you're brand new to film photography, especially large format, you're probably thinking, I can't afford to shoot this stuff. As prices rise, less people are inclined to get into it, and if they are, they don't want to take as many risks. When you stop taking risks, you stop doing things that are creatively you. So for today's episode, I wanted to take you a little bit behind the scenes of some field work I've done with FPP Mummy 400, as well as some studio results from myself and some of my photographer friends. One of the really big advantages to working with a 400-speed black and white film in large format is bigger lenses that cast wider fields of view are typically going to have a higher F number than their equivalent in 35mm and 120. So anytime you can add a little bit of speed to these slow beasts, it's a really nice thing. So with an early start, I headed down to Logan, Ohio, or the greater Hocking Hills region, and I started driving around looking for some neat light and some unique compositions that I hadn't maybe tried before. One such composition was on the way to a state nature preserve called Saltpetre Cave. So right around the corner from where the preserve starts, I found some really neat light that was coming in from around a really neat little winding curve that had a little bit of running water, but also these really contrasty still branches against the rock and the water coming along. So I decided to set up and take my warm-up shot with the 8x10 camera. I went ahead and threw on my Fujinon 250mm, which is a bit wider than standard on 8x10. It ends up being around a 35mm equivalent, and it gave me just enough field of view that I could show the entire scene while really focusing on those creeping branches and the rocks against the water. I wasn't shooting my Fuji lens wide open. I think I was shooting between f11 and f16, but it was still enough that I could avoid a really prolonged exposure. One trait about traditional grain emulsions like FPP Mummy 400 is you do suffer quite a bit of reciprocity failure. Reciprocity failure is as you give the film less and less exposure, you need more and more to compensate for that lack of sensitivity. So in this film, once you hit about a half second of metered exposure time, you need to compensate with about 1 f-stop, and then once you get to 10 seconds, you need 2 to 2.5 f-stops, and then if you have over 60 seconds of metered exposure time, you're really gonna have to have it on the tripod for a long time, and I recommend against it, but you'll need a full 3 f-stops of compensation after that. After taking my warm-up shots along the side of the road, which I thought turned out pretty great, I ended up heading into the main portion of Saltpetre Cave. Even though it's a private state nature preserve, there's a lot of similarities between Saltpetre Cave and some of the other preserves in the area. There's a little bit of vertical, and you do need to squeeze in between some bits of the cave. So I did struggle getting the big 8x10 backpack through. I had to do it in 2 different parts. But once I was there, it was pretty much me and Mother Nature. There was a little bit of flowing water because it had rained a couple days before, but everything was relatively calm. The only downside was there's a ton of sand all over that trail and it doesn't get a lot of foot traffic. So when you set the tripod down, you need to make sure it sits for a few seconds before you take the shot. Otherwise, you're gonna get a few blurry shots. Me too, I got a few blurry shots out of this one. But I got a few of the views that I wanted to. I'm really glad I brought my wide angle lenses with me, namely my Schneider 150 Super Simar XL, which is like a 24mm lens, and my Schneider 121mm f8 Super Angulon. It's a bit of a dreamy lens at the corners, but it really just gets everything in that field of view. One of the neat features with Saltpetre Cave, it is one of the longer caves in Ohio. So it's not very tall. It kind of feels like a rock drop ceiling once you get in there. With that lower ceiling height on the cave, light drops off really, really fast, and you're always gonna have trouble trying to get all those shadows in there. Some of my longest exposures did take place with some of the cave face showing in the shot, but I took advantage of my wide angle lenses having a lot of vignette or darkening in the corners. That ended up helping with the overexposed areas that showed kind of the light coming from behind the trees and gave me enough time to compensate and have a long exposure to get all of the shadow detail I needed from the rock. And for tech data, all of my fieldwork shots were developed in my developer of choice, PyroCat HD, at a 1:1:100 dilution, which is kind of the base dilution for that, 10 minutes at 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. But it's not all field work on this channel. I want to make sure I talk about the portrait aspects of Mummy 400 as well. Another huge advantage to working with a fast film is you can maintain a fast shutter speed. So if you're working with continuous or natural lights, you don't have to rely on having somebody hold still for a long time to get the shot. Now, Mike over at FPP was kind enough to send me a few boxes of Mummy in 8x10 as well as some boxes of 4x5 to test out. And this is because I have a bunch of friends that shoot large format but not necessarily 8x10. I shot a good chunk of the 8x10, but I also gave some 8x10 film to my buddy Mr. Steven Takis. He's who I share this darkroom space with up here at 400 West Rich. Steven did a few portrait sessions, and here are some scans from one of his portrait sessions with Mikey, who was kind enough to pose and kind of showcasing all that lovely tonality. One of my favorite things about these portraits is Steven's really showing how the tonality handles all of the dark areas and light areas. There's some faint shadow details that the film is really good at picking up. And of course, that lovely overcast key light coming in on his subject just looks great. So Steven's test shots were all developed with Kodak HC110 Dilution B for 7 minutes and scanned with an Epson V700 with Silver Fast. In continuing the portrait test, my good buddy Mr. Tariq Terry also took out Mummy 400 for a test spin. He photographed his sons Tayyam and Talal with his 4x5 camera and his trusty Nikkor 180mm lens. All 3 of these shots were darn near wide open at f5.6, and that extra speed really came in handy, making sure he didn't move, his subject didn't move too much, and he was able to get the shot even on a classic Ohio cloudy day. All of his scans were provided with an Epson V850 and nothing really crazy other than the stock software. Another local talented large format photographer, Ms. Cheyenne Banks, took some FPP Mummy 400 for a spin. She invited some portrait subjects over to her studio to test out how it handled various different skin tones in some especially contrasty light against a darker background and with plenty of backlight coming through. I especially like this one shot of Dwight, how that backlight really highlights his hairline and just so much detail. When you punch into 100%, there's grain there, but it's not really that bad. I think at 35 it might be too much, but the way Cheyenne treated it was perfect. She shot this between 400 and 800 and developed again in HC110 Dilution B at 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. After coming back from my fieldwork session, I also had the opportunity to test out how FPP Mummy 400 handled in a more controlled portrait environment. My buddy Imran Nouri was about to head out of town to start his 1000 Strangers project. You can follow that along on his YouTube channel. I'm going to link that down below in the description. And he'd recently picked up a crazy little brass lens. This was a rapid rectilinear lens from the Chicago, Illinois area, and he wanted to test out how it looked on 8x10. Now, he's got a 4x5 and didn't really have much in terms of shutter speed control, so he emailed me and said, hey, can we play around on 8x10? I want to see what this lens looked like. I said, absolutely. We had a time where we'd come together right up here to the space at 400 West Rich, and we started experimenting around. I brought my trusty Tachihara as well as my Cinar auto aperture shutter, and this allowed us, once he had it close enough size onto a Cinar size board, we could pop it onto the front of that Cinar shutter and see how it looked on 8x10. And I have to say, I am really amazed with how nice this rapid rectilinear lens looks. Rapid rectilinears are really compact sized brass lenses. They're not known for being speed demons, so they usually have a relatively small opening. So between f8, f12, I've even seen some f16 models. This one was roughly a 12-inch or 300mm-ish f8 lens, and it's extra swirly and dreamy in the corners, but when you get it just right, man, it's pretty sharp in the center. I did move a little bit when I was posing for Imran. I could have been a better model there, but then I also flipped the script and had Imran pose for a close-up portrait. One note, when I did do this closer up portrait, remember, you have to compensate for what's called bellows extension factor. Even though we were working with a cool 1/60th of a second for my portrait, once we went to Imran's portrait, we actually lost a whole f-stop of light, so we had to move to 1/30th of a second. Always be cautious of that, and that's where something having a little bit of extra film speed really comes in handy. One of the really versatile things about a traditional grain film like Mummy 400 is if you shoot this at box speed and treat it the way you'll see on the FPP datasheet, you're gonna have a really good time. You're gonna be able to make nice negatives that are ready for scanning or traditional silver printing. If you tend to do more alternative photographic process or really like to make negatives that have a little more meat to them, a little bit more punch and contrast, you may want to start out by testing this film at a lower effective ISO. A lot of my nature shots that I did with this film, I did expose the film as if it were ISO 200. And that's because my developer of choice, PyroCat HD, actually loses me a stop on most traditional grain films. You can underexpose it down to about 1600 as long as you compensate by pushing it in development quite a bit, or you can pull back that exposure, just make sure you're also reducing development or else you're gonna get really blocked up negatives. Short of going on auction sites and forums and finding mystery film or super expired film, FPP Mummy 400 is one of the most inexpensive sheet films out there, without considering things like X-ray film and ortho film. For panchromatic and 400 speed, this is gonna be the least expensive you're gonna be able to find. That's my favorite thing about talking about these FPP films. It's not like this is something super premium, even when we talk about 8x10. $4 a sheet, even 5-10 years ago, wasn't a bad proposition, but in 2022, it is almost unheard of. Another thing that can be really hard to convince someone of when they're starting large format is, hey, if you want this really low price, you have to buy a whole ton of this film. Well, they don't even know if they like large format yet. Why would they want to buy 50 or 100 sheets of something? So FPP Mummy 400 in 4x5 and 8x10 also come in 25 sheet boxes, so you don't have to go totally ham on something you're just experimenting with. A note about price and FPP, FPP isn't a coding facility, they're more of an aggregator of films. And one thing that makes FPP really stand out amongst all the other folks that are doing this with film is they take that extra time and try to consider everybody who could be into film photography. So on those 35mm canisters, this isn't just a hand-rolled film that's done by those of us at FPP, it's a hand-rolled film that has a DX code on it. So if you're using point and shoot cameras, it can recognize that 400 speed film and you don't have to worry too much about it. But all the way up to folks that are working with 8x10 cameras, we've got you covered. And for folks that still want to use their vintage 8mm and 16mm motion picture cameras, we've got a black and white negative film for you as well. There are other films on the market that are going to be comparable to Mummy 400. Remember, it does have that single half circle notch code just like Frankenstein 200. And when you wash out the pre-rinse in 120 and sheet film sizes, you're going to see a deep green anti-halation layer. If you have any questions about developing, the main page for FPP Mummy 400 is also going to have some of the recommended developing times and a reciprocity chart. And before it ends here in a couple weeks, this is your last reminder about the 8x10 custom pinhole camera giveaway. You can head over to marrash.com/LFF giveaway, where you can enter for a chance to win this really unique camera that I featured on the channel all the way back in season 1 of LFF. And to sweeten the pot, it's gonna come with my remaining box of Mummy 8x10 films. All you need is a film holder and you're ready to get shooting. If you have any other questions about Mummy 400, feel free to drop those down below in the comments. And for those longer form questions, hit me up, largeformatquestions@gmail.com. Thanks again for stopping by. Enjoy Mummy 400, and we'll catch you next time for more LFF.